Siddhartha Gautama was born a Hindu prince around 563 to 480 BCE. According to legend, it was prophesied upon his birth that he was destined to become only one of two things: a great and powerful king or a spiritual leader. His father feared that if he saw the suffering of the world, he would be moved by his empathy on the path of spirituality, and so he vowed never to let Siddhartha leave the palace to see or experience suffering. But, of course, this proved an impossible task. Siddhartha eventually found himself beyond his father's protective reach and witnessed the 4 signs. He saw an aged man, a sick man, a dead man, and a religious ascetic, and Siddhartha realized he too would age, contract disease, die, and lose all that was precious to him. It was through this experience that the prophecy came to pass, and Siddhartha became a spiritual leader. In response to these 4 signs, he preached his own 4 noble truths: that life is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire, the end of suffering comes with the end of desire, and there exists a long 8-fold path to end desire. His philosophy took a pragmatic approach to the existence and purveyance of suffering, while not condemning ordinary people to lifelong struggle based on the circumstances of their birth. As a result, Siddhartha founded what is, in modern day, the 4th largest religion in the world, and eventually became known as the Enlightened One, or in Sanskrit, the Buddha. Centuries later, in Luoyang, China, during the 11th century, Buddhist teachings continued to grow in relevance and reached the ears of Neo-Confucianist philosopher and poet Shaoyang. Shaoyang was a numerologist influenced by the Confucian classic, the I Ching, which taught that humans and nature were connected by a complex system of naturally occurring numbers. If this system were properly understood, it was said to contain means of predicting and perhaps even influencing the future. Most numerologists at the time conformed to a belief in the pattern of the numbers 3 and 5, but Shao was most interested in the numbers 2, 4, and 8. Because of this, Shao had a particular investment in Buddhist teachings: the 4 signs, the 4 noble truths, the 8-fold path, as well as the 4 kalpas, which refer to the cycles of the world: 4 immeasurable periods of creation, continuance, decline, and destruction. Shao believed the universe had 4 parts, the human body had 4 senses, each idea had 4 manifestations, and every action had 4 choices. Dr. Ulrich Theobald describes Shaoyang's cosmology as follows, quote, "It was based on the idea that the universe was a product of the utmost extreme. The utmost extreme, in which all matter was unified, produced heaven and earth, the former being the result of movements, and the latter that of rest or quiescence. Movement and rest were called the 2 potentials. The change of objects in the course of their life brought them back to the originary divinity. Movement and change was determined by the numbers of the primordial heaven that can be described as a set of preconditions implanted into every object and being. As to humans, these preconditions were installed in his heart. Every thought and action could therefore be traced back to the 4 ordinations in man's heart. Heaven, as a kind of supernatural force, endowed man with an individual destiny which determined his character. The difference between objects, plants, animals, and man was that humans were able to receive the character of all other objects and beings. In other words, the heart was identical to the utmost extreme. The most outstanding superiority of man was that humans were able to recognize the underlying universal principles of the cosmos by observing and assessing things with his heart, and not just with his eyes. Among humans, the superior man would use his heart to understand the hearts of others, one individual to understand all others, one object to conceive 10,000 others, and one generation or age to comprehend the next." Unquote. Xiaoyang would go on to write many poems that depicted his philosophy surrounding change and the hearts of man, as well as his observations of numbers instilled in nature by the primordial heaven. In an introductory chapter to a collection of poems called Yichuan Qilongqi, Xiao wrote, "Though life and death, honor and disgrace, and the struggles of the battlefield constantly shift before me, they have never entered my heart. What difference is there between these fleeting matters and the passing of the wind, flowers, snow, and moon throughout the 4 seasons, seen but once by the eye?" Part of the introduction's last phrase, wind, flower, snow, and moon, was adopted as an idiom, in Japanese, fuka setsugetsu, which in modern Japan can refer to non-lasting, this-worldly pleasures. But the original Chinese from which it derived its meaning refers instead to nostalgia, change, inevitable suffering, and the fleeting passage of time, by likening it to the changing seasons. This is a phrase the introductory chapter of Xiaoyang's collection of poems now shares with the title of the popular video game and global internet phenomenon, Fuka Setsugetsu, which in English is named Fire Emblem 3 Houses.
Reach for my hand, I'll soar away into the dawn. Oh, I wish I could stay here and cherish hope in peaceful days. I fear the edge of dawn, knowing time betrays.
How lovely it would be for this moment to last forever.
The story of Fuka Setsugetsu, or 3 Houses, is split into 2 parts. White Clouds, Part 1, before a period of 5 years passes, and Part 2, one of 4 different routes determined by the player's choices: Verdant Wind, Crimson Flower, Silver Snow, or Azure Moon. The game takes place in the continent of Fódlan, comprising the 3 nations of Fargus, Adrestia, and Leicester, but you'll spend much of your time in the Officers' Academy at Garreg Mach Monastery. This is where students are trained in the art of war, command, and battle. Many of these students are the children of Fódlan's nobility, groomed to inherit massive responsibility, but others are commoners, accepted through a little grit and more than a little money. The class system in Fódlan separates nobility from commoners primarily on the basis of crests, hereditary blood sigils that enhance combat ability. Crests were supposedly gifts from the goddess of the Church of Seiros long ago, and now crest bearers are granted special privileges in Fódlan, despite the fact that crests' powers are dwindling as their bloodlines diffuse over time. In Part 1, White Clouds, school is in session, and the Archbishop who heads the monastery and the Church of Seiros, Lady Rhea, tasks the 3 houses of the Academy, the Blue Lions, Black Eagles, and Golden Deer, separated by Fódlan's 3 nations, with a multitude of missions. Be it bandit routing, rebellion suppressing, mock battles, and everything in between, these child soldiers can do it all. If you haven't noticed, Fódlan has some issues. At the end of Part 1, the leader of the Black Eagle House and heir to the Adrestian throne, Edelgard von Hresvelg, declares war on the Church of Seiros and attacks the monastery, her goal, the unification of Fódlan and the reformation of its nobility and church. Part 2 takes place 5 years later, in a Fódlan steeped in Edelgard's war. In Verdant Wind, the player takes the side of Claude von Rhea in his quest to unify not through war, but through cultural understanding. In Crimson Flower, the player is on Edelgard's side, fighting against the Church, their knights, and the other nations Edelgard wishes to reform. In Silver Snow, we see the conflict from the inside of the church and seek to change it from within, and finally, in Azure Moon, we see the conflict from the perspective of the war-torn Holy Kingdom of Fargus and its equally war-torn Crown Prince, Dimitri Alexander Byleth. The player fights on the behalf of the nation they chose at the beginning of the game, unaware of the path down which it will lead them, and must fight against the two opposing houses after the 5-year time skip. Therein lies the core conflict of the game. Each character is impacted by their circumstances in a multitude of different ways. Fódlan's tribalism, crests, culture, corruption, and the conflicts that surround them. And these circumstances inform their beliefs about how Fódlan needs to change. Regardless of the route chosen, Fódlan's issues are addressed in some form, but also regardless of route, the player will need to kill their opposition. The difference lies in the perspective of the casts of characters, and consequently the path they believe is right to achieve change.
Part 1. Where the Goddess Dwells.
In time's flow, see the glow of flames ever burning bright. On the swift river's drift, broken memories alive.
Nabateans are a real-life group, an ancient Arab people localized around modern-day Jordan. In Three Houses, however, the term is used to describe the children of the goddess. After all, the goddess of Fódlan is far from a fabrication. Over a millennium before the events of the game, the goddess descended upon the continent of Fódlan and became known by the humans of that era as the Fellstar, although she also went by the name Sothis, or the Beginning. Sothis was fascinated by humanity, and if the Church of Seiros is to be believed, she loved them as well. What other reason would she have to walk among them? Although this much may be true, the Church withholds other truths about Sothis, her nature, and the nature of the crests she supposedly gifted humans. During her reign, Sothis created children from her blood in the image of humans, and established the race of Nabateans. Sothis and the Nabateans gifted humanity many things, not least of which was knowledge, and as a result, humanity advanced at an incredible pace, creating technology far beyond their years. But Sothis misunderstood humanity. Or rather, Sothis and the Nabateans could never have understood humanity in the first place. They were immortal, after all, practically gods, and lived lives that were unfathomably long compared to human beings. Conversely, humans' every action is dictated by what they can never escape: aging, disease, death, and loss, constant suffering in the forward march of time. Like the cosmic psychological difference between humans and ants, Nabateans and humans are necessarily divided by their very nature, the guarantee that change is inevitable so long as time passes versus the uncertainty of one's own fate in that passing time. It's no wonder then that Sothis couldn't have predicted humans would turn her gifts into destructive weaponry and use them against each other in the deadly wars for power and influence that followed. Conflicts that, in Sothis's eyes, were brief and inconsequential. The humans' battles scarred the earth, and so Sothis condemned humans who abused the knowledge she so hastily gave them and eradicated them from the face of Fódlan. The few humans in this era who survived the goddess's wrath relied on their forbidden knowledge to persist beneath Fódlan, hidden away and biding their time to exact revenge upon the goddess and her children. Naturally, these humans came to despise the Nabateans, and with only each other at their sides, stolen from any divergent beliefs deep beneath the earth, without even the sun to shed light on their extreme hatred, that hatred would only fester. They became known as the Agarthans, or those who slither in the dark, the shadow of the cavernous gap of understanding between the Nabateans and humanity, and the deadly potential of tribalism and isolation. After this great conflict, Sothis had exhausted her power and entered into a deep slumber. She entrusted her Nabatean children with overseeing Fódlan as she slept, and in this, the Agarthans saw an opportunity. From the shadows, they enlisted the help of the human bandit Nemesis to steal the sleeping goddess's body from her holy tomb and bring her to their hidden society. There, they desecrated her body, turned her bones into a deadly sword, and her blood into the first crest, the crest of flames. The sword of the Creator boasted Sothis's heart in its hilt, and could only be properly wielded by one whose blood bore the crest of flames, and so Nemesis was both granted the sword and became the first crest-bearer of Fódlan, infusing him with strength comparable to that of a Nabatean. Another human rebellion arose to displace the Nabateans, this time led by Nemesis, who was now dubbed the King of Liberation. Humans had come to fear and reject Nabatean rule, which proved too far removed from the nature of mankind to lead them. Supported by the Agarthans in secret, Nemesis led his rebellion to slaughter the Nabateans, and in their lust for power, they created more crests and more matching weapons from their bodies. Humanity was liberated from the rule of Nabateans, only to be replaced by those crest-bearing, relic-wielding humans. An exceedingly small number of Nabateans survived the genocide, not least of which was Sothis's adoring daughter, Rhea. Racked by the gruesome deaths of her mother and siblings, Rhea plotted a counter-offensive to avenge her kind and reclaim Fódlan from the clutches of Nemesis and his bandits. In order to raise an army of her own, however, she was forced to leverage her own powerful blood with mankind, thus cementing crest blood throughout both sides of the conflict in ancient Fódlan. Ultimately, in Imperial Year 91, Rhea's army defeated Nemesis, and Sothis was avenged. But this centuries-long conflict wasn't without its devastating fallout. Rather than perpetuate more conflict and inflict more death upon Fódlan, Rhea decided the most peaceful path forward was to pacify those crest-bearing humans descended from both sides of the war with noble status and influence. This marked the beginning of Fódlan's crest-bearing nobility in Rhea's allied Adrestian Empire, as well as the Holy Kingdom of Fargus and the Leicester Alliance that would soon branch from it. Using her position as head of the newly established Church of Seiros, Rhea would smother the gruesome history of crests, the death of the goddess, as well as her own lineage. In centuries' time, the story became that the goddess, alive and well, gifted Fódlan with crests and relics to protect themselves from external threats and maintain order. No matter the pain she felt witnessing the corpses of her family used as weapons, or the story of their deaths rewritten to become heroic legends, Rhea would give anything to maintain even just a shallow veneer of peace, anything to never again witness the ravages of war. Even still, the numbing pain of loss would never quite leave her. In her grief, Rhea looked to forbidden magic and experimentation in an attempt to revive the goddess, using the heart embedded in the sword of the Creator. Rhea loves humanity and takes utmost responsibility for them despite what they once did to her kind. Still, the crests and nobility which Rhea maintains for the sake of what she believes is peace and which she can simply stand to outlive, impede mortals' natural societal progress. Despite her intentions, the gap of understanding between the ruler and the ruled is perpetuated on both sides. For one lonely millennium, Rhea secretly performs unorthodox experiments, creating and taking life using the goddess's heart, hoping a vessel might one day take the form of her long-lost mother to guide humanity, as though only she, the goddess, knows where humanity's future ought to lead. It's only in Rhea's nature. Sothis is the creator of the Nabateans, her creator, and after the genocide of her people, to look to her goddess for guidance in this time of great isolating strife is all Rhea can think to do. But what is Sothis without the life that she lived, the time that she spent? Even if her body was reforged, would the person she becomes truly mirror the creator Rhea wishes to again lead Fódlan? Because of her own circumstances, Rhea is stuck endlessly pursuing something inhuman, impossible, and buried deep in a long-forgotten past. The recreation of a person without the circumstances that defined them, surrounded only by change she tries desperately to prevent. What is a person without their perspective? Time spent without what defined them.
I wonder, did the flow of time bring you here?
The events of Three Houses begin in Imperial year 1180, following Geralt's mercenary band and his child, Byleth. Although the whole of the band is powerful enough to turn the tides of any battle for the right price, Byleth in particular is almost unusually strong for his status. Although much of it is learned skill, unbeknownst to Byleth and those around him, a crest flows through his veins, none other than the crest of flames. Its origins unknown. The player also quickly comes to learn that Byleth is a silent protagonist, a term used to define a lead character whose dialogue is broadly unvoiced, and often with limited or non-obvious defining traits. In Three Houses, however, this isn't just a gameplay feature, and in dissection of the trope is itself made a defining trait of Byleth. In the beginning of the game, what few words and characteristics Byleth displays are largely all he has. This is a fact that's regarded as almost inhuman by the people around him. It's rare to even find his face displaying emotion. The answer to the mystery of Byleth's crest and his strange nature lie in the circumstances of his birth and upbringing. Years before he took up his blade as a mercenary, Geralt fought as captain of the Church's Knights of Seiros. There at the monastery, he fell in love with one of Rhea's experiments, Citri, who was born from the heart of Sothis, buried in her chest. But when their union bore a child, it was stillborn, empty. Its mother was hardly human, after all. Citri pleaded to trade her life for her child's, and Rhea, though loving of Citri like her own, heard her request and replaced the heart of Sothis into the baby, taking Citri's life in the process. This is where Byleth's crest originated. It's not just hereditary blood. Sothis's very heart physically sits within him in place of his own. In effect, he is one of Rhea's experiments, a vessel to receive Sothis. Geralt became fearful and disdainful of the church after this event, faking the child's death and escaping from the monastery with him. Although he managed to cut their ties with the church for the time being, Geralt found that whatever had happened between Citri and their child in secret left Byleth with no expression and no heartbeat. Geralt's feelings toward Byleth as a result of this are unclear because it predates the events of the game, and neither character is particularly keen on discussing the past, but one could easily imagine such characteristics, or lack thereof, resulting in feelings of discomfort, or maybe even some disdain on Geralt's part. As Xiao Yung believed, the heart was identical to the utmost extreme. All matter unified in one place through the potential of universal understanding. The superior man would use his heart to understand the hearts of others, but what about a man without a heart, without guarantee of his humanity? Naturally, stolen away from society and ushered into the isolating life of a mercenary with a distant relationship to his only family, Byleth would grow up with no influence from the rhetoric and politics of Fódlan's three nations, much less from the church, and nothing to answer for the crest blood flowing through his veins. For about 21 years, Byleth lives his life an amoral killer. How else could he live? He's never known anything more. Sheltered from defining experiences and beliefs, without even the pulse of a human heart in his chest, Byleth is left to become little more than an empty husk.
You can call me Sothis, but I'm also known as the Beginning.
From her heart, Byleth is capable of communicating with the goddess. This version of her, however, is just as clueless as he is. She's underdeveloped and unaware, a far cry from her original, fully grown form. Now, the almighty Felstar is disarmed and forced to witness everyday life through human eyes. Not so coincidentally, this is where the story begins. After Sothis awakens within him, a fateful encounter sees Byleth's fate intertwined with Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude. Byleth saves these three students of Garreg Mach, the heirs and heiresses of Fódlan, from a bandit attack, and the Knights of Seiros insist on his and Geralt's return to the monastery to be rewarded. Geralt knows better than to run from the Knights and Rhea now that they've found him, and tells the church that Byleth is a child he had after he left the monastery, although he likely knows Rhea sees straight through this. Geralt simply entrusts Byleth with the vague task to not let his guard down. This proves a difficult assignment, however, when against all likelihood, Byleth is pushed to become a professor of the 24 bright-eyed youths of Garreg Mach, if only to keep him tied to the church. And so, suddenly, in stark contrast to his upbringing, Byleth is surrounded by life. He's thrust into the deepest throes of society, its people, its history, and its many consequences in the form of the children it raised. Most importantly, a mini army of 8 loyal ducklings are placed under his wing to nurture and protect on the field of battle. Perhaps the greatest difference from his life as a sellsword. He isn't just fighting for gold anymore. This is where the player is given their choice of allegiance between the 3 houses, which will dictate the future of the story. Based solely on surface-level impressions, so random it might as well be the flipping of a coin, they innocently select which house of bright faces they want to teach. The Black Eagles, the Blue Lions, or the Golden Deer. The Blue Lion house is made up of students from the Holy Kingdom of Fargus. From them, the player learns the bloody history of the kingdom, and is faced with the reality of war and its effects on those left behind. The students of the Blue Lion House often focus on slow, yet deeply rooted diplomatic and cultural resolutions to political conflict and prejudice, having been faced with the consequences of change, too swift or forceful. The Black Eagles are made primarily of distinguished nobility from the Adrestian Empire. Their stories center on the corrupted nobility and class system of an ancient empire in decline. Opposite to the Blue Lions, they focus on the military might necessary to swiftly uproot corruption so that it might claim less victims and so new growth might take its place. Lastly, the Golden Deer hail from the Leicester Alliance, a confederacy of nobles who represent their own interests and territories at roundtable conferences. The Golden Deer students are a broad mix of class, belief, and background, whose stories focus on finding common ground despite their differences. Regardless of house, and regardless of what might have otherwise been one's beliefs on the conflict in Fódlan, while playing, the audience will always have bias toward their own students because of so much quality time and exposure to them, even though the unified school season in the first part of the game secondarily bonds the player with characters outside of their house as well. The game makes a risky but rewarding gamble here. It's confident that whoever is playing it will love its characters, because that love will define both its protagonist and the burden you and he share as the story progresses. When war breaks out, those characters you come to love might become your enemies, like equipping all your nearby units with a bow to ensure 90% accuracy rather than 60, however. Three Houses doesn't take this gamble without foremost effort on its part. There isn't a moment of Three Houses left unseized to develop its world and characters, and therefore, due to the nature of bonding with Fódlan's people and understanding its history, inherently intertwined with the questions the game will later pose, there isn't a moment the player spends disconnected from the story and all that it means. In pursuit of that, Three Houses has an impressive amount of high-quality dialogue, fully voiced by talented newcomers and veterans alike, which breathes new life and characterization into even the smallest interactions with playable characters or NPCs. Sure, the reading voice in your own head might understand Dimitri's dismay at being forced to represent the Blue Lions in Garreg Mach's annual dance competition, should you choose him, but Chris Hackney's iconic performance makes it that much funnier.
What? Curse you, Professor!
Each student in this one scenario of many has their own unique voiced dialogue, regardless of whether or not the player will ever go out of their way to see it. And sure, the player could interject their own imagination onto Lorenz's noble attempt at vocal warm-ups when brought to Mass in the monastery's cathedral, but hearing Ben Diskin actually act out his voice crack in real time is just
Something appears to be wrong with my throat.
Joking aside, this goes without mentioning the incredible range each voice actor possesses to portray each character in the many different contexts they're thoughtfully written into, be that a comedic, tense, joyful, or heartbreaking one. You'll see and hear them talking to a close ally over dinner, be that a dinner they really like or really don't like, all of which prompts different dialogue. They'll talk over tea, dating and setting the game and its characters in that particularly posh British zone, during which they have dialogue discussing a multitude of different random things of interest, and will remark about the tea the player has chosen if it's their favorite, or particularly expensive. We see how each character responds to different types of motivation when they're learning in class, whether they've gotten something wrong and receive criticism or encouragement, or if they've done something well and receive praise. When you assign them to do specific chores around the monastery, their dialogue changes based on the task they're doing and who they're doing it with.
Please do not eat the weeds. I am just saying.
After each story chapter, each character's dialogue changes to reflect what's happening in the world, immersing the player in Fódlan with them. On the battlefield, they have multiple lines of dialogue for winning a battle, getting a critical hit, getting a good, lucky level up, a middle-of-the-road level, or a bad level. They have dialogue when supporting another character's gambit attack from a distance. They have dialogue when they're selected above a third of their health, and dialogue warning the player when their health has dropped below that third. They have dialogue for when a unit they're supporting lands a critical hit.
Well met.
Some even have dialogue when they step into a location that's important to them on the map in which they're fighting. Each character also has a multitude of different dialogue exchanges with particular enemy units that are tied to them in some way, be that NPCs related to their storylines or other playable characters that have ended up on different sides of the war after the time skip. This gives a sense of grandiosity to the world, character motivations, and the people you're fighting. Maybe all of the enemy soldiers are just like this one student you knew, and is given emotional weight by the prior wholesome times spent together, which humanize the characters you're fighting. I remind you, all voice acted. Oh, and a huge chunk of this dialogue updates after the 5-year time skip, when the characters' relationships with each other and the player progress in a direction that warrants it, or depending on the route they've been recruited into, effectively taking that already immense number of dialogue and multiplying it by 2. It's absurd how much thoughtful, lovingly written, and fully voice-acted dialogue is packed into this game, and just how much life it gives each character. We also see immersive characterization and world building packed into Three Houses' mechanics. The core of its gameplay, as is the core of its storyline, is in teaching and leading your students. The game progresses through Imperial Year 1180 with a calendar that leaves the player a limited amount of time slots to do with what they will. While all the aforementioned bonding in the academy is occurring, the player must also weigh their time, money, and materials with the ways they want to train their students, or even keep up to date with their own training. For each dinner or tea time the player might want to do for whichever character they want to become closer with or motivate for classes, they must invest the associated time and materials determined by the character's taste, which in turn can be determined by their nationality and personality. As director Toshiyuki Kusakihara said in an interview with Nintendo Dream on the subject, quote, "We particularly wanted the ingredients and styles of cooking to have a sense of reality to them in the established world, so we considered the kinds of vegetables, fish, and whatnot that they'd cultivate. Things like climate and culture all differ between the regions of Fargus, Leicester, and Adrestia, so we added in aspects like the kinds of lives the nobles and commoners live, and the kinds of ingredients they can get their hands on. There were a lot of things we took into consideration. For example, magic can be used to yield crops in the greenhouse, right? So we figured they could make things like ice cream, because they have ice magic too. I think it makes sense that they'd need to use magic in the greenhouse since the monastery is set atop the mountains and it'd be cold there. In their world, they live in a society where magic has progressed instead of science, so they utilize it in manners like that. This is just one way of many that each element in Three Houses, no matter how small, conveys something relevant. Similarly, each individual character has a unique list of battle skills in which they excel, and it informs how easily they can improve and achieve mastery in those subjects while simultaneously highlighting their characteristics. For example, Caspar of the Black Eagles, excitable and always looking for a fight, has poor leadership skills, or as it's called in the game, authority, due to his tendency to rush ahead with little to no communication. Likewise, the Golden Deer's Hilda, who is lazy and often caught shirking her duties, also struggles with authority on account of her lack of enthusiasm to rally her soldiers' morale. On the other hand, all 3 of the titular house leaders excel in authority, something they will doubtlessly need as they take steps toward their desired futures. Edelgard and her loyal retainer Hubert, however, both struggle with white magic, or faith, due to their dislike of the church and ambitions to dismantle it. Perhaps Petra, Claude, and Didu, the 3 students of Garreg Mach who are foreign to Fódlan, also struggle with faith because they don't worship Fódlan's goddess. I could go on. Another mechanic of teaching is budding talents, in which certain students are either bad at or unremarkable in a subject, but given the opportunity, can potentially excel in it. I think the funniest example of this is in Felix of the Blue Lion's budding talent in dark magic. Initially, he has a Bane in magic, but those 3 little stars that indicate a budding talent next to the skill might entice the player to assign it to him and diversify his utility. Once they do, however, and I think this is so funny, he will instantly come up to your desk and tell you to take him out of it because he just wants to do swords. If the player insists, Felix will eventually develop an affinity for the art, which might lead him to the Mortal Savant class, a blend of his interest in swordplay and his newfound talent in magic. Likewise, each character has a unique list of special abilities they unlock by progressing in particular skills. Along with this, each character has one ability automatically embedded in them, called a personal ability, which is defined by their background. For example, the aforementioned Felix's personal ability, Lone Wolf, means he's stronger without a battalion assigned to him. Further cementing his stubborn, isolating attitude, he prefers to fight on his own. Felix's fellow Blue Lion, Ash, was led to a life of thievery after a great plague in Fargus took his parents, and so his personal ability, Lockpick, reflects that, although it may come as a surprise in contrast with his earnest personality. My favorite of these is Byleth's personal ability, Professor's Guidance, which means any unit who performs an action next to him in battle will acquire 20% more experience. It's as if to say when Byleth is there to critique their performance, they learn and improve faster. There's little pieces of storytelling and characterization that happen in every move on and off the battlefield. Three Houses is so intuitive. You may not know offhand the formulae that undergird these mechanics, and although it's of great benefit in navigating the nitty-gritty of higher difficulties, you don't always need to. They're implemented well enough that they just make sense when laying your immersion in the world and your understanding of the characters and their capabilities over a strategic context. You may not know that what determines your unit hitting twice is if their attack speed, AS, is at least 4 higher than the enemy's, which in turn is determined by their speed minus the quantity of their weapon weight minus their strength divided by 5 rounded down, but it really only makes sense, doesn't it? How fast someone can attack with a weapon depends on how swift they are set against the weight of the weapon or shield they're wielding, while accounting for their physical strength, which determines how well they handle that weight. And at first, you might not realize the simple benefits of switching the equipped weapons of supporting units to improve accuracy, but it just makes sense that having more allies capable of striking the same enemy would make that enemy less evasive. They have to be aware of more incoming attacks. All the while, the battle UI is so readable and smooth, you can enter this almost flow state where a million technical factors and individual goals for your students are running through your mind at once, but you're moving your army as swiftly and intuitively as if you were a real commander on a real battlefield, without all the paraphernalia, just tactics and common sense. The reality of combat is carefully integrated into the game's technical mechanics. Your strategizing doesn't come at the cost of role-playing or force you to look solely under the hood and reveal all Three Houses' 1s and 0s to win. Its 1s and 0s represent strategy and incentivize you to integrate roleplay into your strategy to succeed. In this way, Three Houses is a model blend of strategy and role-playing that anyone can understand and have fun with, regardless of their gaming background. A seizing of all the genre can be. You need only immerse yourself in the world. And in a wonderful display of storytelling working hand in hand with gameplay, like any good teacher, the player is quietly rewarded for taking note of and encouraging their students' interests and strengths, as well as pushing them to try new things they might benefit from. Last, but most certainly not least, while you're playing the game, its visuals take great care to elevate the text. From the grand, complex, yet surprisingly realistic architecture of Garreg Mach and the gritty fortresses the player visits in battle, to the bright personalities inhabiting them. The Church of Seiros, both visually and structurally, references medieval Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church. Its ornate, towering, isolated Gothic structure pointed toward the heavens and settled symbolically between political powers, the cultural hub of merchants and citizens at its base, and the knights in its service quickly call to mind an influential religious order with a strong, potentially oppressive grasp on culture and politics throughout the nation. From the player's bird's eye view, the maps outside Garreg Mach are grounded and realistic, yet sized down almost like a meticulously handcrafted old board game with hundreds of little hand-painted pieces, fittingly meant to be walked on by toy soldiers. Even here, you might see Garreg Mach looming in the distance. We see the influence of Fódlan's three nations in the designs of some of these battlefields, which define how they might be fought. To the south, Adrestian cities are designed with detailed buildings and narrow alleys in the image of Italy, particularly Rome, to call to mind a lavish yet deteriorating ancient empire. The capital city of Enmar even boasts its own Colosseum. Fargus, on the other hand, is much more primitive and practical for its harsh climate and culture. It most closely resembles medieval English or Celtic environments, with wide open squares and little to no unnecessary detail adorning its humble villages and sturdy castles. Lastly, Leicester, the youngest of the three nations, takes after Fargus in reference to their origins and past political disagreements. But in their attempts to distance themselves from the kingdom, they're even more lavish than Adrestia in their art and architecture. The port town of Deirdre even boasts cute little parasols on its docks. Most importantly, inhabiting these settings are dozens upon dozens of memorable characters, with equal visual storytelling and influence from their circumstances. According to director Kusaki Hara, lots of careful deliberation was made on the part of lead character designer Chinatsu Kurahana to make each character memorable while not disregarding uniformity or their nationality. Since so many characters are introduced at the same time, it was important that they could be told apart. Quote, "The goal was to have each class's students embody the characteristics of the place they come from, so we consulted with Kurahana-san and carefully went with what we came up with in those meetings. This cautiousness rightfully paid dividends. Although many of Three Houses' characters have complex or unusual old names, which are hard to keep straight at the beginning of the game, it's even more difficult to forget the features in their wonderfully illustrated and expressive portraits. For as long as you can't remember Lauren Helm and Gloucester's name, you'll be able to call him the purple right-angle bangs guy. This memorability is also despite the fact that during the first part of the game, all the student characters are dressed in Garreg Mach's academy uniform. Each uniform is thoughtfully altered to complement the character of the student without losing the identity of the uniform in order to achieve both strong visual characterization and the strict uniformity of the church and its armies. Naturally, Sylvain would wear his uniform with its sleeves rolled up to his elbows to show off his forearms, and his blazer unbuttoned to give him that sleazy, roguish look. And of course, Adrestia's three most influential noble children, Edelgard, Hubert, and Ferdinand, would be the only characters to wear those regal, clean white gloves. The Golden Deer's meat-headed Raphael's buttons are popping off of his uniform. The Black Eagle's Dorothea, the only commoner in their ranks, accessorizes and dresses to accentuate her figure in her eager search for a wealthy spouse, where the Golden Deer's shy and insecure Marianne covers and obscures herself. The aforementioned Ash and Bernadetta of the Black Eagles both wear hoods under their uniform blazers. The former likely due to a comfort and familiarity with hiding in the shadows, and the latter in looking for a way to hide herself from social situations whenever she so pleases. This isn't even to mention Byleth and his colleagues, the members of the church, and the other characters who inhabit Fódlan outside of Garreg Mach's uniform, all equally telling designs. But just in case this wasn't enough, after 5 years pass and all the students grow up, their designs, features, and portraits naturally change and mature along with their dialogue, effectively giving the majority of the cast 2 designs. 2 concepts, 2 models, 2 portraits for the beginning and end of the story, marking their characteristics and growth in and out of the academy. It's here where we really see the distinction between the nations and storylines drawn, fitting when the characters are now divided by their allegiances instead of united under the church. Kusakihara says, quote, "I told Kurahana-san that I wanted each character's outward appearance to absolutely ooze how they've been living their lives over the past 5 years. And this is exactly what they do. The Blue Lions, for example, are plated in strong armor and sturdy leather, in reference to their long losing struggle against the Empire and northern invaders. This goes for all save Annette and Mercedes, who, in those 5 years, were kept from battle due to political tensions with neighboring noble houses and restrictive family ties, respectively. The Fargan cast naturally has a motif of blues and cold colors, as well as thick, heavy cloth and warm fur to protect protect against their country's cold northern climate. Conversely, the Black Eagle's designs are an evolution of their more regal outfits from the Academy. The stylish, flowing cloth and shiny gemstones bring to mind their status and the Empire's wealth, as well as their slight distance from the front lines. This goes for all except Petra, the princess of an archipelago once conquered by the Empire, who returned home and immersed herself in her own culture during the time skip, and Caspar, who, due to bearing no crest and therefore inheriting no title, can only distinguish himself on the battlefield. Both of these things are reflected in their designs. The Golden Deer heed no particular pattern as a group, which itself is in reference to Lester's governance and Verdant Wind's storyline. Each character stands for such different interests and has such differing perspectives and beliefs that when placed next to one another, they literally form a rainbow of different colors. In Kusakihara's words, quote, "The concept behind the Lester Alliance was a republic based on roundtable governance, where the nobles are all out to get each other, so nothing really gets accomplished. Just imagine a group of people with a few colorful individuals holding the rest back." Perhaps this is to say the picture they paint when they come together, despite their differences, is a natural and beautiful one. Every single element of Three Houses is absolutely sopping with intention, thorough characterization, and world building, due in large part to just how much Fódlan's world building and the earnest interest in exploring all avenues of its ideas leaves to experience, even in just sitting across from Edelgard on her birthday and sharing her favorite cup of tea. There's an understanding that this content is, despite not being part of the string of cutscenes that progress with the gameplay, still very much a part of the story, if not what establishes the bulk of it. It's a huge part of the experience, and so it's made relevant. Or perhaps it's a huge part of the experience because it's so relevant. The player is interacting with the story and its meaning even during what might seem like downtime. Three Houses asks if we really have a choice in what we believe and who we become when we're so wholly influenced by our circumstances, the people close to us, and what we see. To quote director Kusakihara once again, what this says in short is, history is nothing more than what the victor chooses it to be. There are many who have lied about history throughout the stories found in the game, and you can't believe everything you read, even the historical accounts found in the books in the library. This brings us back to Byleth. Regardless of house, after months and months of teaching, fighting, and living side by side, the player and Byleth, as well as the goddess Sothis seeing through Byleth's eyes, naturally end up in the same place, unshakably bonded to their students and with an unwavering duty to protect them. Because of that, they also gain a new foothold into and bias toward the world of Fódlan, its history, and especially its pressing issues that have so prominently affected their students of choice. They gain perspective, a point of view. The once empty vessel that was Byleth, alongside the player and Sothis, is filled in with the experiences of the students he grows to love. This means, then, that the whole time, Byleth always had the potential to become empathetic and wear his emotions. It was the isolated circumstances Geralt took him into and the things he sheltered him from, preventing that part of Byleth from flourishing. Geralt comes to realize this too. In Chapter 9 of Three Houses, he says,
You've been angry since we first arrived in Ramire village, and you look so happy when you're instructing the brats. Before the monastery, I'd never seen you bear your emotions like that. Not once. Then perhaps it's a good thing we came to the monastery, if only so I could see your face lit up like that. Or maybe there was never any reason for us to leave the monastery in the first place.
The choice to take Byleth from the monastery was perhaps a selfish one on Geralt's part, albeit one born of genuine feelings of fear and grief. It was a choice comparable to that of the father of Buddha, that the answer to his son's potential fate, a fate of a spiritual nature, was to shelter him from the true cruelty of the society surrounding him in the hopes that the lack of exposure would drive him from understanding and leading other people. But seeing what became of Byleth once given 4 signs of his own, Geralt decides, Despite whatever fate awaits him, the trade was well worth it. Now he can finally watch the image of Citri, their child, nurture life instead of take it, like he was always meant to.
You're just a pathetic old man.
Sorry. It looks like I'm going to have to leave you now. Huh? To think that the first time I saw you cry, your tears would be for me. It's sad, and yet I'm happy for it. Thank you, kid.
Well into the story, Geralt is killed by Agarthans in an attempt to lure out Byleth, and by proxy, Sothis' heart within him, to finally erase all traces of the goddess for good. After so long listening to, understanding, and empathizing with his students' struggles, finally, the tragedy becomes his own. For the first time, Byleth cries. For the first time, he feels an anger so prevalent he allows himself to fall into the Agarthan's trap just for the chance to kill the woman who stabbed Geralt in the back. In his pursuit, he's trapped in an Agarthan ritual from which, in Sothis' words, it would take the power of a god to escape. By now, though, the player and Sothis know fully well who and what she is, and what she means for Byleth. Sothis bequeaths her strength to Byleth in order to save him, even though it'll do away with what little consciousness she gained and what insignificant life she lived through Byleth in the process.
So long have I been on this path with you. Through you, I got to see and hear this world. I may not have acted like a goddess, but it was certainly fun. For all that you have done, thank you. I'm glad that it was you to whom my fate was bound. Now, we must pray, for if we share this wish, our spirits too will join as one. Your wish is to return to the forest, stop the enemy, and rescue the little ones. No need for words. I know your heart as though it were my own.
I know your heart like it is my own. While this is a direct reference to the literal state of Byleth's heart conjoined with Sothis', it also speaks to the complex relationship between Sothis, Byleth, and the player, at the core of which lies the heart of the game. No matter the route, Sothis will always disappear into Byleth, her own character literally overtaken by his in her inability to act or perceive for herself. The life she's living is Byleth's, not her own, but regardless, it's all she knows. The same can be said of the player. As Sothis says, in seeing the world through Byleth's eyes, there is no need for words. Even when Byleth is silent, we understand what he thinks and feels, especially toward his father, his students, their ambitions, and their struggles, because it's what we are thinking and feeling as someone who shares his perspective. He and the player are the same as much as the player and Sothis are the same. Not in the sense that he can be endlessly projected upon without contradiction, but that the game cleverly predicts how players will perceive and interact with it, and subsequently crafts characters that can be understood without words as feeling the same way, because they've experienced the same things. Because of this overlap, in this scene we can understand Sothis as speaking for all three parties, that their priorities have shifted from those of an uninvolved, ignorant outsider fighting for no reason other than persistence to a mentor fighting to protect. Geralt's death instigating this is a straightforward way of showing that change. Although it leaves a heavy impact on him at first, Byleth has found who he is to the world of Fódlan, and can now lead a life on his own. He understands what he really wants isn't to kill, but to protect. His tears are evidence of that. When he fails that desire, it's enough to drive even him to cry. Although they may be expressed in their own unique ways, in their overlapping circumstances, the beliefs and desires of Sothis, Byleth, and the player are one. It's no coincidence that after this symbolic merging of persons, Byleth obtains the title of what the game calls the Enlightened One, which you might remember in Sanskrit translates to the Buddha. The parallel between Byleth's story and the legend of Buddha clearly drawn once more. In this scene, this wordless and unconditional understanding, even just between these three parties, is presented as something almost godlike and unattainable, the utmost extreme in which all matter is unified through the human heart's ability to understand, personified. In what real life could such a thing be possible? Three people with the same heart. A person seeing only through someone else's eyes. Perfect empathy.
So the Fellstar consumes even the darkness itself.
In his silence, and in understanding him and the world through his eyes in spite of it, Byleth is an exploration of the concept of a protagonist itself, and a demonstration of the powerful influence of perspective. Although our own circumstances will never be as extreme as Byleth's, having a baseline guarantee of empathy and understanding instilled in our hearts, maybe we're all a husk of some kind. An empty vessel to be filled in by our experiences. The idea that what we see and experience determines who we are permeates every inch of Three Houses. Although you may not realize it at first, Three Houses is demonstrating its purpose every chance it gets, even through the way in which you, the player, see its world. Despite this, for the duration of the story, Rhea sees Byleth as a vessel for Sothis, and an almost messiah-like figure, if only because of Sothis within him. She chooses to interpret Byleth's enlightenment as a step closer to Sothis overtaking him, rather than the opposite, still in denial about the reason her experiments continue to fail. And so Rhea continues to preserve the past in the hopes that it might one day return more peaceful than before, no matter who might suffer in the shadows of her stagnating rule. The idea that one's actions and beliefs might not be their own, that were defined by our past and circumstances, is a terrifying one, after all, especially to those ambitious individuals who believe so strongly that their way forward is the most just one.
Even if one clings to their faith, the goddess will never answer them. Countless souls will be lost that way. And I can be counted among those who have died that way as well.
Edelgard von Hrasvelg was born to the Adrestian Emperor Ionius IX in imperial year 1162, the sister of 10 siblings, young and old. She would be the only one of them to survive to the year 1180. All but one of the imperial children were killed in captivity during gruesome ritual blood experiments to endow them with an artificial crest of flames. Edelgard attributes these experiments to a corrupt group of Adrestian nobles for whom her father, the emperor, was merely a puppet on a string, although the means to do so and the experimentation itself was in collaboration with the Agarthans. Edelgard survived the bloody experiments with 2 crests, the crest of Seiros, inherited from her lineage, and the artificial crest of flames. Only, as a result of the experiment, or perhaps the twin crests themselves, her lifespan was greatly shortened.
It is the same as yours, the crest of flames. When it manifested for me, I swore a silent oath. For the sake of my family, and for all the poor souls whose lives were traded for my existence, I will build a world where such meaningless sacrifice is never again sanctioned. As Emperor, I will change the world. I swear it.
Edelgard despises crests and the church's traditions that place crest bearers on a pedestal. Ironically, perhaps due to a belief that the church and Fódlan's other two nations would be a greater challenge, for which she would need allies, she forms a reluctant truce with the Agarthans that gave her this new power and privilege in their overlapping goals to see crest blood eliminated, or at least in Edelgard's case, to see it no longer encouraged by societal benefits. She believes the only effective way to achieve this is through war and total immediate reform, both of the church that incentivizes the nobility and the three countries' nobility themselves. Doubtless, they won't give up their privileges so easily. Edelgard and Rhea are opposites. Between them, the mortal versus immortal conflict is drawn once more. Edelgard, like the ancient humans of Fódlan, feels strongly about the immortal meddling with the mortal from the perspective of someone with a shorter than average life. The change she desires and believes in all her arrogance only she can bring about cannot wait for the sake of what she sees as a shallow peace, much less as long as Rhea can stand to wait. Yet, there's another side to Edelgard that's impossible to ignore without diminishing her character. Behind the mask of the Flame Emperor, and before the Adrestian Empress who rules with an iron fist, there is this Edelgard.
Reach for my hand, I'll soar away into the dawn. No, I wish I could stay here in cherished halls, in peaceful days. I fear the edge of dawn, knowing time betrays.
Dawn and astrology symbolism in Three Houses' story, similar to the introductory chapter of Xiaoyang's book of poems, represents the inevitable passing of time and change. Just as the sun must set at dusk, dawn will eventually take its place. Viewed this way, the title and related lyrics of Three Houses' theme song, The Edge of Dawn, is packed with meaning. I don't typically like to point to sources disconnected from a story as the main or sole example of its writing if I can help it, because I value highly how something stands on its own. But that's exactly what makes this theme so good. It doesn't tell the player anything they don't already know, but it provides a powerful and concise way of thinking about the story once they do know its meaning, or even just subconsciously as they're experiencing it. With the way the Edge of Dawn's motifs are so prominently used throughout the game to correlate certain emotions with certain melodies, it's very much intertwined with experiencing the story. In The Edge of Dawn, the speaker refers to herself as a red rose, a crimson flower, the title of Edelgard's route, and makes many other references to Edelgard's circumstances. Because of this, one can interpret the song as being sung primarily from Edelgard's perspective. In this context, the song speaks to both the inescapable fate she's been thrust into since the day the crest of flames manifested in her blood, as well as her inevitable death, fast approaching. To say that, in truth, Edelgard fears dawn, fears change, and the passing of time, when on the surface she cries out for it, is to say that despite her strong sense of duty and convictions due to her past, like Rhea, a part of her deeply desires normalcy and stagnation, if only, quote, for this moment, lost in time. This is what her strong feelings for Byleth represents. Throughout the game, whether Byleth takes Edelgard's side or not, we can observe a strong borderline romantic desire in her for his allegiance. These feelings are at once the innocent pining of a girl who wants to indulge in simple things like romance alongside her peers while she still can, as well as the desire for approval from someone with no preconceived notions or biases about Fódlan, for someone so unadulterated to take her side, for someone to see who she is, or wishes she could be, beyond the politics and the path carved out for her. So even when Byleth doesn't side with her in the war, even if he never chose her house to begin with, the potential he represented to Edelgard and the feelings of longing she had because of it remain. As the song says, Edelgard is like a red rose seeking the sun, no matter where it goes. Rhea is wrong to believe that Sothis can be brought back as the same person when she can only see a changing world through someone else's eyes, much less a human's eyes. Perhaps Edelgard is wrong too to see Byleth's ignorance so idealistically and opportunistically, but she also finds solace, I think, in the idea that he had the chance to choose his own path despite his circumstances, or perhaps because of them, like Rhea wishes for Sothis, and like Edelgard quietly hopes for herself. I think much of this can be said of the game's other main characters as well. The Edge of Dawn primarily serves as Edelgard's theme, yes, but viewing it strictly this way, or as only thoughts in Edelgard's head, does a disservice to just how pervasive it is. In many ways, the verses and choruses that so blatantly depict Edelgard's feelings can also mirror the game's other main characters, the events of their routes, or simple concepts that they all relate to, albeit often from Edelgard's perspective. One of the more obvious examples of this is the references to the monastery and the academy before the war. It's no coincidence that the lines "Faint lights pass through colored glass in this beloved place, silver shines, the world dines, a smile on each face, as joy surrounds, comfort abounds, and I could feel I'm breaking free, for just this moment lost in time, I'm finally me," share their melody with the theme of the monastery.
Faint lights pass through colored glass in this beloved place. Silver shines, the world dines, a smile on each face.
This is a feeling expressed by many characters in every route. Nostalgia for a long since lost time, and a desire to, quote, stay where the light dwells. Every time the player hears the motif of the monastery, be it in The Long Road, where it takes on a somber sound as they battle through their former students, or The Apex of the World, the final battle theme of 2 routes in the game, they're given a glimpse at that past and made to think on that concept all the characters long for. And just as Edelgard literally hides behind the mask of the Flame Emperor, Rhea masks her Nabatean origins, her immortality, and her goals in re-establishing Sothis' reign. Claude masks his identity as an Almiran prince for fear of the prejudice he faced in childhood, and Dimitri hides his bloody quest for revenge beneath a noble, chivalric front. And just as Edelgard's heart was blackened and scorched by the literal crest of flames, one could say Rhea, Claude, and Dimitri's hearts were also scorched by the flames of war and conflict, and can't run from the paths it carved for them or the people it made them become. Most importantly, the references to reaching for another's hand as a form of understanding and empathy is heavily present in every route, and therefore can be interpreted as something other characters wish for as well, for a hand extended to them, or a hand to extend to others. So when we find the Edge of Dawn purveying so many aspects of the game, we're not only hearing Edelgard's rallying cry as each moment passes, a moment closer to the dawn, to her death, we're hearing the more subtle ways each character can relate to the same concepts as we experience their respective answers to her strife. This is what makes Edelgard such a great antagonist in 3 of the game's routes. Much like the game's protagonist, so many key aspects of her and her ambitions can be wordlessly understood and related to by the player and the other characters simply by experiencing comparable circumstances. Every single character in the game, regardless of house, struggles with crests, the church, the nobility, the death of loved ones, or even their own mortality. So when the player unlocks those experiences in other characters, they're simultaneously understanding more about Edelgard, even when they don't know it. But in the end, because of what different beliefs those unique circumstances culminated into, they must put a stop to her ambitions. They can reach out their hand to her, but so long as she believes she cannot take it, this conflict will continue.
The blue moonlight cuts across our sight as pure and clear as a ringing bell, reaching for us in the night as the wind calms my thoughts. I hold strong on this terrace, I feel at peace, carried away by the wind song.
This part of the bridge is in reference to Edelgard's fate and the routes aside from her own, evidence to suggest this theme is sung from the perspective of a regretful, antagonistic Edelgard left abandoned. This might also be why, at the end of her own route, the song is lyricless when it plays. She no longer feels such lonely longing. Edelgard feels she's only truly herself when silver shines, in reference to silver snow in the church's monastery before the war. The blue moonlight cuts across her sight, azure moon, and the wind song carries her away, verdant wind. The latter 2 of the 3 especially referring to her death at the hands of Dimitri or Claude. In this interpretation of the song as coming from a solitude Edelgard, the lyric "Don't ever take back your kind hand, lest precious love slip away like time's sand," which one might interpret to be in reference to her and Byleth in the context of Crimson Flower or Silver Snow, must be referring to something else. Either something more theoretical, like Edelgard's view of Byleth and someone else, the character coinciding with the route the player has chosen, or a different character entirely.
Open the door and walk away. Never give in to the call of yesterday. Memories that made those days sublime. These ruined halls and tombs, stolen time. Reach for my hand.
This part of the Edge of Dawn can, again, refer to Edelgard's aspirations. At the end of the song, the collection of her deepest regrets and desires, she tells herself to walk toward the future, toward the dawn, in spite of her fear and regrets. But both of these lines also have much more direct and obvious meanings in relation to another character, which the player can only understand when they reach the end of Azure Moon.
Part 2. To War.
After Edelgard declares war on the Church of Seiros, she leads an assault on the monastery where Byleth falls in battle. But Sothis' power isn't so feeble. It takes 5 long years of rest, but eventually Byleth awakens to a new Fódlan, on the cusp of change. Seeing your students grow without you during this 5-year jump in time is, in some ways, a triumphant feeling, but in others, the guilt of leaving them behind during such a critical time is crushing. The promise made with Sothis, protecting them, guiding them, going unfulfilled. The name of the song that plays in this moment, Unfulfilled, yet another variation of the Edge of Dawn, reinforces that this is what the player is intended to be feeling, and by proxy, what Byleth is feeling. On a more surface level, unfulfilled could refer to the promise made with the students to meet again after 5 years, where the song literally titled "A Promise" is used. But seeing as that promise technically is fulfilled, I find it more compelling that it's in reference to that pivotal scene depicting the merging of Byleth and Sothis. I also don't think it's a coincidence that the song which directly precedes the time skip, "A Vow Remembered," prominently features a heartbeat in reference to the inhuman circumstances of Byleth's birth, but his capability for empathy and humanity, which drives his desire to protect his students regardless. So for both him and the player, this 5-year gap is only more time lost, a greater divide of experiences, and less understanding. A vow remembered, yet unfulfilled.
I should have known that one day you would be haunting me as well.
Of all the characters in Three Houses, Dimitri has the most stark visual change from his younger self. Prior to the 5-year jump in time, he's bright-eyed and earnest, sporting a meticulously kept light head of hair and the only Officers' Academy uniform with armor. The plated uniform both refers to the knightly, unforgiving nature of he and his country, and to the fact that he's the sole living, crest-bearing member of the Fargus royal family. His life is, at least to his country, more precious than most, and must be preserved. And yet Dimitri himself believes far from the same thing. He constantly downplays his status, encourages those of less status not to treat him any differently, and is humble often to the point of self-depreciation. He's sensitive to injustice and deeply conscious of how it affects his people, despite being caught on the nuance of how things ought to change. Dimitri is perhaps the most empathetic and soft-hearted character you'll meet at the start of the game, if a bit temperamental and naive in his principles.
I believe those with crests and those without should acknowledge the other's strengths and learn to respect each other based on personal merits. And that doesn't apply only to crests. The same holds true for lineage, race, faith, ideologies. If we could just accept each other and make mutual concessions one step at a time, perhaps... Who knows if that's even possible? Everyone has something that is unacceptable within them. I certainly do, and I'd wager you do as well. I wonder which is best, Professor. To cut away that which is unacceptable, or to find a way to accept it anyway?
When the player sees what becomes of Dimitri 5 years later, however, there is little surprise. He's missing an eye, and the one that's left is darkened and sunken in. His hair is long and unkempt, his speech is snide and cruel, and most importantly, bloodthirsty. In those 5 long years, Dimitri's vagrant lifestyle, after his kingdom is conquered, is likened to that of a beast's. Similarly, my favorite thing about his older character design is the black inside of his heavy cape, which blends with his dark armor. Like an animal's diamatic display, it's as if to obscure his form, to make him look larger than he is and frighten others away. But how could this change not be surprising? If empathy and understanding is held in the highest regard by Three Houses, even likening that of a perfect nature to enlightenment and godhood, what does it say about this character who comes so close only to, in practice, fall the farthest from that goal? The Holy Kingdom of Fargus is home to Dimitri and the rest of the Blue Lions. Upon the country's historic independence from Adrestia in Imperial year 751, they were proselytized by the Church of Seiros in exchange for support during the war, both in an attempt to grant such a militaristic faction a moral foundation, and to grant the Church more sway over a divided Fódlan. Its brutal geography, settled adjacent to northern invaders, its unforgiving climate, and its revolutionary origins made Fargus many enemies and many challenges to overcome in daily life. This culminated in a traditionally slow and stubborn country which, of the three nations, is most similar to our foremost associations with the medieval era. All-powerful kings and queens, deadly plagues, bloody coups, and most importantly, a cultural focus on concepts like knighthood, honor, and chivalry, especially in death. In a country where death is so pervasive, its people find solace in the concept of honorable deaths and noble sacrifices. As a result, unlike those of the Empire who are politically savvy, the nobility of Faerghus are hardened warriors first and foremost. Crests are also held in high esteem in Faerghus. As Dimitri puts it, they're the metaphorical blade wielded by the nobility to protect their people from threats. Despite the efforts of Rhea and the Church, however, Fódlan in the modern era is changing. Fewer and fewer nobles are born with crests, and new ideologies take hold all throughout Fódlan as a result. In Adrestia during this time, the nobles conducted their insurrection against Emperor Ionius IX shortly before their crest experimentation began, and Edelgard was temporarily removed from the Empire by her maternal uncle Arundel. Edelgard and Arundel took shelter in the kingdom capital of Fhirdiad, and it's there she met Dimitri, her younger brother by marriage. Unbeknownst to Edelgard, her mother Anselma, one of the emperor's many consorts, had also been exiled from Adrestia and was secretly married to Dimitri's father, King Lambert, whether out of genuine affection or as a political move. Anselma's existence was kept a secret from nearly everyone, including Edelgard, and so at the time, neither she nor Dimitri were aware they were related in this way. Likewise, Anselma was also kept from the knowledge that her daughter was in Fhirdiad. Little is known about Anselma after her exile from the Empire, however, and so it's unknown whether her ignorance was perpetuated and she was isolated from the world in an act of protection or selfishness on the part of Lambert, or if more nefarious factors were at play on the part of Agarthans who began to infiltrate the ranks of Fhirdiad's court in order to sow contempt for the king within his queen consort. Maybe all three factors were at play at once. Regardless, during her time in Fhirdiad, Edelgard and Dimitri became fast friends. Although all the game's characters are united during their time at the Academy, Edelgard and Dimitri in particular share this special experience even further in the past. In recounting those times, Dimitri says,
"She seemed quite bored with everything. She was being dragged all over, unable to live the life she wanted."
Because of this, when Edelgard and Arundel were inevitably forced to return to Adrestia, and when Edelgard is faced with her fate as the Flame Emperor who will reforge the world, Dimitri gave her a parting gift, which ironically sealed her fate.
"You've got to cut a path to the future you wish for, no matter what."
Thank you, my dear forgotten friend. Because of you, I never lost my heart.
Soon after Edelgard and Arundel left for the imperial capital, where Edelgard was placed in captivity with her siblings and emerged the only survivor, Lambert was killed. A bloody coup occurred during the king's diplomatic trip to the neighboring Duscur region and claimed every single life in his company, save for Dimitri's. Anselma disappeared, and although it's implied she took part in the coup, it's unclear whether or not she escaped the chaos. She's never heard from again. The blame for the tragedy is placed upon the Duscur region, and a subsequent genocide is carried out against its innocent civilians to retrieve Faerghus's pound of flesh in return for the life of its king. But there's, of course, much more to it than that. A handful of people from Duscur assisted in the assassination, as well as a few nobles from Western Faerghus who opposed Lambert's progressive reform. But most importantly, the same league of corrupt Adrestian nobles, as well as the Agarthans allied with them, supported the slaughter from the shadows in order to destabilize Faerghus in preparation for their experiment's future conquest. Meaning, in a roundabout, ironic way, the tragedy that took everything from Dimitri was carried out for the sake of his only remaining family and closest friend. Ever the romantic, Edelgard even implies that all that time ago, Dimitri was her first love, perhaps for the same reason she later falls in love with Byleth. His kind-hearted naivety sees through to her true self, and might encourage her to cut her own path to the future. Although it must have been in a childish and unrealistic way, one can interpret Dimitri as having felt the same. Where the Edge of Dawn recounts of stolen time and memories that made those days sublime, it's both in reference to the Academy of Garreg Mach, as well as Edelgard and Dimitri's close childhood companionship, disrupted by the tragedies that befall them. In the song's words, "Only we will know all that was lost. Scars that we can't erase show us life's true cost." The gruesome murder of his friends and family right before his eyes, of course, left Dimitri changed. He survived the slaughter, but a piece of him remained there, suffocating under the guilt of being the only one to come home alive, the guilt of the subsequent genocide of Duscur, and the powerlessness of being unable to help while he waits to come of age and succeed the throne. In all Dimitri's soft-heartedness, he believes his life belongs to those who died so he might live, and he believes what they want, the only thing they could want, is revenge. He puts aside what might have otherwise been his good nature, telling him to understand his opposition, to find common ground, in order to become a vessel for the dead, enact a will he believes they want, and assuage his guilt. But the history of Faerghus and the tragedy has an immense ripple effect that reaches all of its inhabitants, not just Dimitri. Faerghus and the Blue Lions best showcase Three Houses' strength at having a deeply interconnected and meaningful cast, both to each other and the greater story as a whole. Each interaction you observe between them is like discovering one small piece of a larger puzzle. The tragedy creates a microcosm of Three Houses' core conflict. Due to the different ways each character is tied to the tragedy, they each have different beliefs on or as a result of it. For example, Annette's father, Gilbert, was a knight in service of the king, who was absent during the tragedy. Due to the immense shame and dishonor of failing his duty so thoroughly, Gilbert disappears from Faerghus and devotes himself fully to the Church of Seiros, in a futile attempt at redeeming himself in the eyes of the goddess. He demonstrates the depth of the impact of Faerghus' culture and the destructive consequences it has in the wake of tragedy. After her father disappears, Annette works herself to the bone to get a recommendation to Garreg Mach, where her father fled. As a result, she grows up with a hard-working attitude and a devotion to learning, yet a somewhat destructive belief that her value comes in the form of her work, and an inability to slow down and give herself well-deserved breaks. Still, Annette is quite progressive when it comes to challenging Faerghus' traditional values of one's worth in their duty or in their deaths, perhaps for everyone but herself. Ironically, her self-critical nature makes her that much more similar to her absent father. Likewise, Ash is also critical of himself, if only due to the belief that he's indebted to his noble adoptive father, Lonato, for taking him off the streets, and must make the most of the opportunities given to him. Unlike Annette, however, Ash's adoption causes him to idealize knighthood, and knights like Gilbert and Lonato. But when Lonato's biological son Kristoff is implicated in the tragedy of Duscur, truthfully or not, Kristoff is executed by the church, and Lonato incites a militia of civilians to rebel against them. Ash must then contend with the idea that the real counterparts of the knights he reads about in his favorite books may be more complicated human beings that betray traditional black and white concepts of chivalry and loyalty. Sylvain has less of a direct tie to the tragedy, aside from his close childhood friendship with Dimitri, but the stubborn culture Lambert attempted to change, and which ultimately had him killed, is one that Sylvain feels passionately about. Sylvain is notoriously philanderous among his peers. but this self-destructive behavior is far from an indulgent one. Sylvain's noble territory borders northern Faerghus, where invasions are commonplace, and therefore, in Dimitri's words, crests are a necessity, not a luxury. When Sylvain's older brother Miklon was born without a crest, but Sylvain was, Miklon was disinherited. After years of abuse by his brother and unearned praise from his parents, Sylvain grows up with acute knowledge that his value is in his crest, and grows to despise that fact. He drowns himself in the attention of women who want him solely for his status, begins to generalize women into this category, if only to toy with them and break their hearts in the process. Felix, Rodrigue, Ingrid, and Dedue are perhaps the four parties most profoundly affected by the tragedy following Dimitri. Rodrigue and Felix, father and son, lost family to the coup. Felix's brother, Glenn, a young knight in service to the royal family. Ingrid, close friends with Felix and Dimitri, as well as Sylvain, was engaged to Glenn and admired him a great deal. Like many in Faerghus, Ingrid and Rodrigue both idealized knighthood and Glenn's death in the tragedy as a means of coping. He died like a true knight, in service of protecting his liege. It's an idea that brings great comfort to them, that maybe Glenn died without regret. In such staunch idealization, however, Ingrid also grasps onto propaganda that places blame on and dehumanizes the people of Duscur, a black and white story with a villain to lay blame on, rather than a multifaceted political move. Although Ingrid herself seems to realize how illogical this is, her own grief and anger at the death of her childhood hero clouds her judgment. She's incapable of empathizing with the Duscur victims. When doing so would call into question the rigid beliefs that helped her move on. In the face of Ingrid's prejudice, Dedue is hardly a staunch advocate for himself. Dedue became Dimitri's loyal retainer after Dimitri managed to rescue him, and him alone, from the genocide that took place in Duscur. Ever since, Dedue devoted his life to him. He sees himself solely as Dimitri's sword and shield, both because he has so much faith in Dimitri's kindness and the change it might make for both of their peoples, but also because of his own lack of identity and self-worth. His country, his culture, and his family are all but gone, and he was powerless to stop it. He has nothing else. There's at once something admirable yet frustrating about Dedue's stoicism. He understands why people like Ingrid hold the beliefs they do, and does nothing to try and change those beliefs, no matter how justified he would be, and no matter how reliable and kind the person buried beneath the cold exterior is. Yet, in simply learning to let down his guard and be who he truly is, in sharing his culture, his passions, his humanity, his perspective with people he thought would despise him, Ingrid and those like her can't help but see the faults in their ways. After all, Dedue represents everything Ingrid so admired in Glenn, in his loyalty to his liege, but more importantly, his wholehearted belief in the cause his liege stands for. He is a true knight. And lastly, there is Felix, Rodrigue's son, Glenn's younger brother, and probably the next most important character in Azure Moon, following Dimitri, Byleth, and Edelgard. Despite Felix's prickly attitude and standoffishness, he weighs the value of life heavily. Following the tragedy, Felix watched as the world around him glorified Glenn's death, as though it were a good thing his brother died. He died like a true knight. To Felix, this takes on a much different meaning.
Chivalry begets the worship and glorification of death. Am I alone in finding that grotesque?
Felix views Faerghus' culture and those who perpetuate it cynically. Surrounded by people obsessed with justifying the past, he's a voice of reason. Still, Felix is somewhat immature in his own right. The player will probably agree with his ideology, but precisely because of his progressive beliefs on chivalry, knighthood, and Faerghus' worship of death, Felix isolates himself from the rest of the cast that doesn't believe the same things. He's unwilling to recognize that the ideology he opposes can also, in moderation, be a means for people to cope with death, because it was the opposite for him in grief. The way he stubbornly imposes his beliefs on grieving people makes those beliefs unappealing. Even still, his stubbornness comes from a place of care. No matter how harsh he is to people like Ingrid, Ash, and Dedue, it stems from the belief that their lives have inherent value, greater than some set of ideals. This is the reason why, despite Dimitri's similar disagreement with the idealization of knighthood and death, he apparently frustrates Felix most. Having witnessed the gruesome deaths of Glenn and the others firsthand, Dimitri opposes Ingrid's idea that it was something noble to be proud of. But in place of that belief, Dimitri blames himself for the tragedy and shoulders revenge the dead may or may not have wanted, which Felix hates even more. Dimitri is still harming both others and himself, and piling up more corpses for the dead. The same destructive ideology all of Fargus believes still haunts him, that the dead are anything but that. Gone.
The dead are dead. The living are living. You have to respect that boundary. If you keep stringing gravestones around your neck, you'll snap. If you're too weak to do that, abandon your throne. Become a gravekeeper.
The Blue Lions' past struggles inform their complex and flawed beliefs, and the ways they both agree and disagree with one another's ideologies. Although they each cope with war and subsequent loss in different ways, they come together to fight for one notion, that they must do everything they can to ensure they never experience that loss again. It's interesting, then, to observe the ways in which the Black Eagles oppose the stories of the Blue Lions. Not to say that the Black Eagles don't suffer, or suffer less, but rather that the broadly different ways they suffer inform different beliefs. Their stories highlight struggles incited by a disconnected bureaucracy, more so than the purely visceral, physical disease and death of a more primitive society like Fargus. Linhart, the Black Eagle's medic, can't even stomach the sight of blood. The Black Eagle's suffering is the type that has little to no closure, since the answers are so hazy. Why did this have to happen? There are thousands of complex answers, buried deep in political warfare. It makes sense, then, why their story might portray a group attempting to uproot that complex system, which their experiences tell them is so thoroughly rotten through war. Whereas the Blue Lions story portrays a group trying to prevent war by attempting to heal that rotten system. This difference is clearly displayed in the contrast between Ash and Caspar. Their short story together shows the two of them attempting to sniff out a thief stealing from the monastery's rations. Ash with the intent to understand and persuade the thief to stop, and Caspar with the hard-headed desire to, quote, take this guy out.
If you let people get away with stuff like this, it's only gonna get worse. If we're gonna uphold justice, then we gotta stop evil. Simple as that.
I'm all for the rule of law, but indiscriminate slaughter isn't going to solve anything. You can't just execute someone on a wild assumption and call it justice.
And you can't just hide behind your fancy words. You have to take action.
Mercedes, the last Blue Lion, is also rather disconnected from the tragedy of Duscur. In fact, she's not even from Fargus, but rather Adrestia. Her story could fit right in with those of the Black Eagles. Political strife and desperation from the nobility seeking her crest led her to flee the country and take shelter in a Fargan church, where values of charity and empathy were thoroughly instilled in her. But in Mercedes' disconnect from the experiences of her Fargan classmates, yet her powerful empathy for them regardless, she most strongly represents the spirit of their story. Despite their differences, she strives to understand them more than anyone.
As unwavering as your convictions may be, the others also feel strongly about their beliefs. If you hate all those whose beliefs are different from yours, you will hate everyone eventually. People with exactly the same beliefs as you simply do not exist. You do not have to change your beliefs, of course, but you do have to accept that others feel differently.
We can also find this idea explored in the third part of Three Houses trifecta, Claude and the Golden Deer. I'm sure you've noticed this third has gone unmentioned for a long time. Claude invests himself in the conflict of the game, but he's rather disconnected from it historically. This is by design. Edelgard and Dimitri have a storied past together, but Claude is a complete bystander. To the east of Fódlan is Elmira, a large, geographically diverse country marked by their warriors and love of battle. They look down on Fódlan's church and governance and believe them to be cowards, which motivated past Elmiran armies in their many attempted invasions of the neighboring Leicester Alliance. The threat of Elmiran invasion was historically treated with utmost seriousness by all three of Fódlan's nations and was perhaps the only thing that united them in common cause. The Officers' Academy itself was established under the church as a means of unifying Fódlan's nobility to face such foreign threats as the Elmirans. In modern-day Fódlan, however, Elmiran invasions have mellowed to a point where infrequent skirmishes on the border are fought almost out of obligation, if only for the sake of satisfying the deeply rooted prejudices both sides came to hold of one another. To Rhea, this prejudice is key to Fódlan's relative harmony. So long as there's camaraderie between groups in one place, there must be a common enemy in another. In maintaining Fódlan's internal peace, Rhea believes she must also maintain its isolationism. During this time, Claude was born to the noble daughter of Leicester's Grand Duke and the King of Elmira, who was charmed by her free spirit. Growing up in Elmira, Claude faced relentless bullying by his siblings for his Fódlan heritage, as well as attempted assassinations in their desperate squabbles for the throne. Troubles with the inheritance of the duchy also arose in Leicester, and Claude was called to Fódlan as its only remaining heir. There, he found prejudice in equal measure against his Elmiran half. This experience granted Claude a unique perspective. By virtue of his birth, he was an outsider to everyone. The revelation Claude has creates a strong desire in him for change, similar to Edelgard's. He wants to undermine the church's grasp on Fódlan's culture and governance, to usher in a new age where prejudice isn't a foundational principle, and people are encouraged to exchange new ideas and share cultures. Despite fighting to rescue Rhea from the Empire in Verdant Wind, Claude wonders what the world would look like without Rhea in it, if her death would take the metaphorical lid off the bottle. In this way, he sympathizes with Edelgard's cause. What separates him from Edelgard, however, and places them on opposite ends of the battlefield, is the belief that founding this new age on bloodshed is, quote, not something the world can get behind. This quietly implies he himself might stoop to that, were it not for the fact that it interferes with his lofty ambitions for global harmony. When speaking with Edelgard before the time skip, Claude claims the ambitions he holds in secret are selfless, as though he has nothing to gain from them. I don't think this is entirely true, and I think Claude comes to accept this too, not because the ambitions themselves can't be selfless, but because of the way and the reason why he pursues them. Claude's experiences instill in him something alongside his ambition, an instinct to distrust others and to distance himself from the people around him. In his deceitful nature, he betrays the ideals he vies for in secret. Claude dreams of a world where people listen to and understand one another despite their differences, yet he's unwilling or perhaps afraid to be the one to earnestly show his hand and open his heart to others. He'll read and manipulate and lie to enemies and allies alike to get what he wants, but ensures it's never himself on the line. One might even say, as of Imperial Year 1185, that Fódlan has much bigger fish to fry within its own borders, but Claude sees Edelgard's war as an opportunity. While the church's rule of Fódlan is destabilized, he can establish new leadership without taking the fall for bloody rebellion. Fight like your life depends on it, but flee if you're ever truly in danger. This is an ideology Claude holds both for his closest allies and himself. He initially pretends not to have skin in the game, but behind the easy smile is an overwhelming desire to be accepted, no matter what, and to prove that the prejudice he faced was wrong. It's only under Byleth's tutelage, alongside the diverse students of Garreg Mach, that Claude realizes what he wants isn't something that can be walked into blindly by his subjects, or quietly mandated by rule of law. It's something that must be pursued on an honest, individual level. There's only so many secrets and weaknesses he can pry out of others before he must bear a weakness of his own. He can end hostilities and give people opportunities, but the only thing that can truly affect the change he wants is their own willingness. The only way Claude can influence the thoughts of others is to lead by example, and honestly show himself in turn.
You lack the courage to challenge me in lone combat.
Yet we have the strength to scale the walls between us, to reach out our hands in friendship so we can open our true hearts to one another. That's how we win!
Claude's story naturally leads him to discovering and putting an end to the Agarthans. He puts his adversarial feelings toward the Church aside in order to understand them instead, and finds the Agarthans representing everything he wants to change about Fódlan and the world at large. Hatred driven by willful ignorance. He comes to understand that Rhea, a victim in her own right, was only doing what she could to maintain peace, and that his hostility toward her may have been hypocrisy on his part. This development sets him opposite to Dimitri, where Dimitri puts aside his inherent empathy and good nature in favor of blind hatred due to his guilt. Claude learns to overcome the preconceived notions he didn't even realize he held, both in his distrust of the Church and his own allies. As Claude says in Azure Moon, he and Dimitri are, quote, cut from different cloth. In this way, Claude is the house leader most similar to Byleth in background, where Edelgard and Dimitri both steeped in the worst of Fódlan for far too long, which gave them extremely unflinching views. Claude and Byleth are more malleable. Their ignorance toward Fódlan for a large portion of their lives taught them there's often more than meets the eye. This similarity is likely why Claude feels such kinship with Byleth. But the clash between Claude and the Agarthans, the Agarthans' mere existence, begs the question, is Claude's ambition really even possible in the way he wants? The Agarthans lived alongside the Nabateans, but their natures inevitably created a deadly rift between them, and Rhea, while given few other options, did bring a stop to large-scale military conflict in Fódlan by unifying the three nations under the Officers' Academy and against foreign countries like Elmira. After the war, is unity something that the clashing people of Fódlan, much less people outside Fódlan, can accept? Can the forced coexistence of perspectives that oppose each other so drastically lead to anything but more suffering and conflict? How far can empathy really reach? This brings us to the result of the tragedy of Duscur on Dimitri, and how his emotions reflect it. Dimitri is empathetic and kind, yes, but his hatred and aggression isn't opposite his empathy. It's born of his empathy. This is what too much of a good thing looks like. He feels so much love for the victims of the tragedy and the victims of war at large that it blinds him to anything else, much less to qualms that might drive someone to incite such tragedies. Being isolated with the voices in his own head, literal or otherwise, chastising him for 5 long years only emphasizes this. Dimitri is so empathetic toward the victims that he listens only to what the manifestation of his guilt tells him they want, and grows spiteful toward anyone who so much as questions those desires. After all, if avenging and honoring the dead is the duty of those left behind, what does that say about those who choose to move forward instead? Because of this, it's so compelling to find that in comparing the game and its events to the seasons in nature, wind, flower, snow, and moon, Dimitri is likened to the moon in both his route's title and the lyrics of The Edge of Dawn. In the song, the moon is referenced only in the bridge. The blue moonlight cuts across our sight, as pure and clear as a ringing bell, reaching for us in the night. But something about this lyric is odd. The Edge of Dawn only refers to the speaker plurally twice. once in the line I previously likened to Dimitri and Edelgard's childhood friendship, and the other when referencing the moonlight. Who is the hour in this line? Since we know Dimitri is the moon, it can't be him again. Instead, I think here Edelgard is referring to both herself and Byleth being affected by Dimitri in a similar way. Initially, Dimitri's kindness and purity is the force that makes Edelgard falter and question her path most, the force that cuts across her sight, and in the same way it touches Byleth in the coldest, most apathetic point in his life as a mercenary, the night, and changes him. Even in just skimming through footage of the game for this video, we can find that Byleth smiles and scowls much more often and much earlier alongside Dimitri and the Blue Lions than he does in all other routes. This, of course, isn't to say that he inherently cares for them more, but rather that in being exposed to Dimitri's sincere and passionate nature, Byleth takes on the same characteristics much faster. Conversely, The Edge of Dawn compares Byleth to the sun when it says Edelgard is a red rose seeking the sun, or in the sense that his warmth, once he finds it, might melt away snow, used in reference to Rhea and the Church, meaning he might uncover their secrets. Byleth is also referred to as a star within the events of the game, the Fell Star. It's as if to say Dimitri, or the moon, only exists in its fullest, brightest form when it has the sun, light, or Byleth, to reflect. This reinforces the idea that Dimitri, more than anyone, is extremely emotional and influenced most heavily by his environment. He will reflect back what is given to him, whether that's kindness and empathy or aggression, even when it makes him believe himself a monster. This may be a reason why Dimitri coaxes Byleth into taking revenge after Geralt's death. Each house leader approaches comforting Byleth during this part of the story in a different, characteristic way. On the surface, Dimitri softly empathizes with him and tells him how he dealt with loss. Claude opportunistically uses Geralt's death as a means to gather more information about the Church and understand the circumstances of Byleth's birth, and Edelgard rather harshly informs Byleth that he has to move on, and that she can't stand to wait for him. It's easy to say Dimitri's approach to this is the best one, but looking beyond the pretty words, the advice Dimitri gives Byleth is essentially to allow himself to cling to his hatred and use his desire to kill in place of a desire to live. Even though it's presented in a sweet, easy-to-digest way, it's destructive advice that, when followed, leads Sothis to have to sacrifice herself to save Byleth. Perhaps the reason Dimitri does this is because he wants to find that ideology in this person he so respects, as if to justify the same path for himself. He's projecting. And although Byleth sees that advice through, he realizes after losing Sothis and endangering his students in the process just how short-sighted Dimitri's reason for living really is. In this way, perhaps Edelgard's approach to Byleth's grief is the most honest one.
Only you can truly understand your own sadness. Others can sympathize, or even empathize, but all anyone else can offer are the tears of an outsider looking in.
Just as Claude is Dimitri's opposite, and Byleth is similar to Claude, Byleth is set opposite to Dimitri as well. The opposing development of Byleth and Dimitri is readily drawn by likening them to the sun and the moon, light and dark, two opposites in constant fluctuation. As Byleth's environment changes, becomes lighter, and awakens his humanity, Dimitri's environment is enshrouded in shadow, isolating him and pushing him to extremes. It's also worth noting that these are the two characters toward which Edelgard explicitly holds feelings of adoration, one in the past and the other the present and future. Clearly, she sees something similar in the two of them, which one gained and the other lost. And in the same way, Edelgard and Claude both view Byleth's ignorance as an opportunity to both gain a powerful ally and the companionship and approval of an unbiased, unprejudiced onlooker, where Dimitri begins the story quietly disturbed by Byleth's expressionlessness, especially when he kills. In his own words,
"I thought of you as someone who felt no strong feelings about killing your enemies. I could never trust someone who kills without batting an eye. My heart won't allow it."
And ironically, it mirrors what he later allows himself to become. Byleth develops as Dimitri's foil. If the player chose their house, Dimitri and the Blue Lions saved Byleth from apathy, and with them he experienced the depths of sorrow and hatred. He reinforced those same emotions in Dimitri as his mentor, then inadvertently abandoned him for 5 long years. So it falls to Byleth to reach out his hand and pull him from the darkness, like Dimitri once did for him, if only he would take it.
As big class reunions go, this one's gotta be the worst in history.
Years ago, we fought here as classmates. But not today.
Kill every last one of them!
The battle at Gronder Field is one of 3 Houses' greatest emotional climaxes that pays off the outcome foreshadowed since the beginning of the game. The 3 armies meet for an all-out battle to shift the tides of the war, and it parallels an innocent Mach battle once held under the church during the academy days. But now, all of those well-meaning students you came to love with their own beliefs and ambitions are no longer in Byleth's care, and instead stand at the edge of his blade. The game makes another connection to Neo-Confucianism here. The theme that accompanies this pivotal battle, titled Between Heaven and Earth, could be read as a reference to Xiaoyang's cosmology of the primordial heaven. If heaven represents movement and earth represents rest, then to be between heaven and earth is to be on the brink of movement, the cusp of reluctant change, just as Fódlan is. This is what its leaders believe is necessary for change. This is the reality of war and of beliefs so uncompromising that one would kill to see them to fruition.
The thought of fighting people who were once our friends, it makes my heart heavy. It did often seem strange to me at the academy that we were studying with all these people from all over the world. But I feel like I've finally started to understand the real reason behind it.
It's because of you that I've had the courage to leave my room for a bit each day.
I'll
continue to learn and grow from your instruction, Professor. Thank you.
The more you get to know people from other places,
I'm glad that I came to the Officers' Academy. You're inspiring, Professor.
the harder you'll try to avoid fighting wars with them.
It's here that, finally, Dimitri's obsession with revenge crumbles. He, too, is on the cusp of change, not from the death of his classmates or from his failure to defeat Edelgard once more, but rather from the sacrifice of Rodrigue. In an ironic twist, the sister of a general Dimitri killed during his rampage infiltrates the Kingdom army in order to avenge her brother, and attacks him at Gronder. When he's finally faced with the same grief and hatred he himself is driven by, Dimitri appears almost to give up, to allow her the revenge he so strongly believes will free those left behind of regret. His twisted, destructive form of kindness rears its head once more, but it isn't meant to be. Prior to Gronder, Rodrigue attempts to convince Dimitri that their army would be better served emancipating Fargus from the Empire, rather than in a senseless, suicidal chase for revenge against Edelgard. He also claims that would be what the dead would want as well. He's one of a few capable of pushing Dimitri's delusions without fear of repercussion. Dimitri respects him a great deal. In response, Dimitri tells Rodrigue not to put words in the mouths of the dead, because they're, quote, his words alone, even if he borrows their lips. And so, in reuniting with him after 5 years, Rodrigue begins to understand what must be done. If Dimitri's heavy guilt stems from the victims and the dead, and therefore in this state he can only empathize with the dead, Rodrigue elects to put himself in their place, to sacrifice himself for the sake of becoming something Dimitri is capable of empathizing with, and telling him not to kill and die on their behalf, but rather to live for his own beliefs. The people whose deaths Dimitri shoulders didn't die for him to repay some sort of bloody debt to them. They simply did what they believed was right, Rodrigue included. His sacrifice at once affirms the beliefs of people like Felix and people like Ingrid. His death is noble and has much impact, if only for the sake of helping Dimitri realize what the dead would want is for him to enact his own kind-hearted will, to move on. As Dedu puts it,
"What he was until recently is what he had been for as long as I've known him, so tortured by his compassion for the fallen that it had driven him mad. He has always been too kind to be king. He has always felt too much for the weak and the dead. That is exactly why I look up to him."
It doesn't chase away the sadness and regret, but it's enough for Dimitri to take Byleth's hand that was long since extended to him for the sake of his own beliefs and the people who have faith in him. It's enough for him to realize that the people he harbored such hatred toward are doing the same thing. His guilt looses its vice grip on his empathy, and he can finally see clearly again the humanity of his enemies, what they're fighting for, and the true reason he believes he must stop them.
No matter how much you grieve, the dead will never return. No magic in the world can bring them back. That's why their memory clings to the living like a curse. The more they were loved, the tighter their hold, and the more suffering they cause. Professor, I entrust the young prince and the future of Fargus to you.
The song A Vow Remembered, which I previously mentioned in its relation to Byleth and his resolve to protect his students before the time skip, features in another prominent scene here. That is, the scene in which Dimitri breaks free of his guilt and promises to retake Ferdiad and save his people. Here, Dimitri and Byleth's opposing development finally intersects, represented by this recurring song. Dimitri has learned the same lesson Byleth did, or maybe Byleth has successfully taught him the same thing, led him down the right path, like Rodrigue hoped before his death. They won't kill or die on behalf of something, but they can live for something. For both of them, this is the people they love. Byleth, his students, and Dimitri, his subjects. Ingrid also discovers something similar alongside Dimitri, and Felix, Sylvain, and Dedu's storylines touch on that subject as well. For those so submerged in Fargus's deadly culture, finding the value of their lives is their own way of overcoming ignorance.
Your hands are so warm. Have they always been? I believe we have spoken of this before. Everyone has something they simply cannot accept. As for Edelgard, I am certain she will never be able to accept the Church of Seiros. I believe that is why she seeks to destroy it. She is looking to revolutionize the world, in her mind, for the better. But even if she manages to birth a new world, it would be at the cost of... I wish to end this war through acceptance, not annihilation. Just as my people accepted me, I wish dearly to accept her. But I fear...
Perhaps the conclusion Dimitri comes to is too naive for the leader of a nation, but what's truly the right or wrong path for Fódlan and where it may progress after the credits roll is far from the story Three Houses is interested in telling. Whether Edelgard's means are worth her ends, whether Dimitri can truly affect change with such soft-hearted ideals, whether Claude's ambitions are possible, and whether Rhea's rule of Fódlan was necessary or not, it matters very little. Black, white, or gray, their rigid morals are their own, affected by their circumstances. Three Houses leads its characters and its player through the limitations and vast reaches of empathy and acceptance. Ignorance, willful or not, permeates Fódlan's fragile peace and its bloody history. The immortal Nabateans in the ancient past were wise, but unable to understand those Agarthan humans they shunned. In turn, the Agarthans were ignorant to the Nabateans and deemed them and all their descendants evil. The nobility of modern Fódlan feels an immeasurable responsibility to fix their broken country, but in the wake of their lofty ideals, the citizens and the poor suffer. Grieving Fargans stubbornly look for something to blame for the past, where revolutionary Adrestians sacrifice anything for the future. And the students set to inherit Fódlan long for peaceful days where they lived side by side, and were ignorant to the fact that it couldn't last forever. Should the player see Dimitri's story to its end, they storm the imperial capital and face Edelgard alongside the rest of the Blue Lions. A renewed desire for peace and acceptance within them. Ingrid and Ash find moderation in their ideals. Felix finds understanding for people like his father, and Sylvain and Dedu find allies who subvert their cynical expectations of society. The war teaches them all the dangers of such sweeping imposition, and together, under Dimitri, they defeat Edelgard and put a stop to her forceful reform.
These fools are caught up in the sacrifices at hand, and cannot see the future ramifications at stake. We must trample the past underfoot, and move onward to a brighter tomorrow.
To be changed beyond all recognition. That is what lies at the end of the ideals you served so diligently. We must defend the present. After all, it is all that we truly have.
The final scene of Azure Moon plays out with only a single word, an affectionate nickname from a long-lost time.
L.
And yet, it says so much. Dimitri is no longer saddled with revenge or guilt, and for the first time since the tragedy, he's that earnest boy who Edelgard fell in love with again, who gifted her that symbolic dagger, and who wanted nothing more than to accept his friend. In this final moment, without words, with just the knowledge of the circumstances that define her, the outstretching of her hand, and the thrust of the dagger given to her all that time ago, Edelgard silently says two things in response. She says that she is living, fighting, shedding blood, hers and others, to see her beliefs come to fruition. She says that she will not, cannot live any other way. She will live by her beliefs, cut her own path, and any other life, a life where in this moment she takes Dimitri's hand only to give in to his future, is to her no life at all. But then she also says something else. She says to Dimitri that he must do the same, cut his own path, with the same conviction he once inspired in her. There's a deep trust in her in this moment, I think, that she can look at Dimitri's soft-hearted gesture and smile, knowing the future he will endeavor to build is one that won't forget the plight of a single wayward soul, not even her own. Can we truly choose who we become? Or are our beliefs, actions, and futures preordained by our surroundings? Can those whose circumstances teach them such opposing lessons truly find common ground? Can humanity ever escape such tragic realities as war and prejudice, so long as time marches on and suffering is inevitable? Though life and death honor and disgrace, and the struggles of the battlefield constantly shift before me, they have never entered my heart. What difference is there between these fleeting matters and the passing of the wind, flowers, snow, and moon throughout the 4 seasons, seen but once by the eye? Three Houses is a cautionary story. There is no one person to be looked up to as a beacon of righteousness, or to be totally condemned. The evil of Three Houses are those tragedies catalyzed by inescapable human error. By granting its audience this brief glimpse into its world, Three Houses simply gives us the opportunity to reflect on our own circumstances and how they influence our biases. It tells us to try to understand, try to be kind, no matter how impossible it may seem, to share our experiences with its characters and world with one another, and to understand someone else's experience in turn. Because maybe in some different world, different circumstance, different time, maybe we could have made another choice, befallen a different fate, and the people so divergent from our own perspectives could have been our closest companions. Thank you for watching. While I think this video went a bit beyond scratching the surface, it's not exhaustive. There's undoubtedly much more to discuss. Somehow, it keeps going. Three Houses has been on my mind for about 5 years on and off, a time skip of my own, and it's weird to think about how different this video would be had I made it 5, 3, or even just 1 year ago. There's a lot to get caught up on, but ultimately what I believe and hope to continue to bring to the table is that love and honest introspection are the primary ingredients of something lots of people enjoy for a long time. Three Houses continues to pass that test with flying colors as people share stunning fan content, fond memories, and thorough discussion that highlight the depth of the game's world and characters, even 5 years later. It's very open-ended criteria, and certainly some roadblocks and hiccups can arise even if you love something with all your heart, but I think if you make what you love, what you're earnestly passionate about, and find the deepest answers in your soul as to why you want to make it, you'll probably make something good, and something that inspires great things in others. What more could a creative ask for? I hope to continue to explore the many different ways that manifests, and how we artists can better share that passion with audiences as I move forward from what, for some reason, feels like a landmark. That said, I know a lot of you probably know me from Fire Emblem, which is also probably my fault for making it 60% of what I've talked about, but there's a good chance this will be the last video I make on the subject, with maybe the exception of more shorter Three Houses related content because it's just the best one. No, I think it's just the most interesting and worthwhile one to talk about extensively, and the height of what they've managed to achieve so far. It's also undoubtedly the one most people are most interested in hearing about. Maybe I'd be up for talking about Fates because I think I actually have a unique perspective on that, but again, huge maybe, not for a while. So if you're interested in the perspective I might bring to other content, please stick around. There's more where that came from. And if you're mostly just interested in the Fire Emblem, that's fine too. Stay cool. Maybe we'll meet again. Thank you for your patronage. I pour my heart and soul into these videos. I do all my own script writing, recording, obviously, editing, and have recently been forced to get all my own footage because of the very specific demands of my weird scripts. All this with the unsung support of my dear sister, who I love very much and who is the other half of this channel. I love doing this, but it really does take it out of me. So like and share, perhaps even a subscribe would go a long way. And if you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend watching my last video on Liza P. I'm really happy with how that one came out. Boost that shit, please. It's peak, as the kids say. Regardless, if you feel impassioned by Three Houses in any way, I encourage you to please share your own analysis below, be that a different perspective on something I already touched on here, or something I didn't get to at all. I would love to read your thoughts, whether they're about your favorite character and how they relate to what the game stands for, what they meant to you, what the game as a whole means to you, or even just a single moment or line of dialogue that impacted you when you played the game. To quote director Toshiyuki Kusakihara one last time, quote, "To the people who are overwhelmed by the amount of content in the game, I say that you can experience the full story by playing through just one route." I thought that it might be interesting where, even if you picked the same house as somebody, your experience could differ from theirs. The player would go through the game once and really experience the world. Then they'd talk about it with someone else and think, we played the same game, right? Why are we talking about two different things? I didn't really think players would end up going through the game that many times. For me, games are a way to simulate a world and its story as if the player were experiencing it themselves. I wanted to signify that the world is more expansive than what the player sees in the game. Even among the development team, I don't think there's a single person that could claim to understand everything about the game. I couldn't help but think to myself, it has a soul. The expanse of the world of Three Houses has exceeded our expectations, and it feels like we're handing it off now, in a sense. It's a little sad, but that's how I know we've really created something so special. Nothing would make me happier than seeing people's love for this game for many more years to come. Fuck, I'm gonna cry. I love this guy. Anyway, Three Houses emulates the real world and real experiences within it by giving the player only one of a few glimpses into its society, one of a few perspectives through which they could see the world, then encourages them to seek out other perspectives and find the missing pieces with others. In a time of deep division and social isolation, Three Houses asks us to seek out one another and to share our beliefs. So, in the spirit of this truly special work of art, be introspective, have dialogue, and see other perspectives. Three Houses is so earnestly married to this concept that it permeates even the way it was intended to be experienced. Three Houses is an experience meant to be shared. Thank you. Yippee! I have fun. My head kind of hurts a little bit. Oh, my throat hurts even more. There we go. Okay, bye-bye.